Sadly, I'm not saying that we'll ever be without war. I think war is a part of human life. The trick is to keep it to as a minimum.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yvonne Hunter, and I'm the head of programming at the Appel Salon here at the Toronto Public Library. I want to welcome you to what I know will be one of the most fascinating conversations that we will have on stage this fall. So let the snow fall, and let us turn our attention to Fields of Blood, Religion and the History of Violence. Karen Armstrong, the acclaimed author of A History of God, joined us on this stage in 2009, and she returns with a question that all civilized societies are grappling with as ISIS terrorists perpetuate a new reign of terror. Does religion lead to violence? If you have read her already critically acclaimed new book, it has been called bold, powerful, epic, erudite, and a mighty offering, you will know that the answer is no. To prove her point, in Fields of Blood, she covers roughly 5,000 years of religious history. She will be interviewed tonight by Michael Enright, who himself brings a unique and provocative perspective to this subject. Michael Enright is one of Canada's most distinctive voices, well known as the host of CBC Radio 1's The Sunday Edition. He first joined CBC Radio in 1974 as host of This Country in the Morning. He has written for Time, Maclean's, the Toronto Star, and the Globe and Mail. Michael became the managing editor of CBC Radio News in 1985 and co-host of As It Happens in 1987. He co-hosted the program until 1997. When Peter Zosky retired, Michael Enright co-hosted and then became the sole host of This Morning. In 2000, he became the host of Sunday Edition. On December 30th, 2012, it was announced that Michael would be inducted into the Order of Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Enright.
Thank you. Welcome to February. Thank you for coming out on a night like this. It's extraordinary, and it's great to see you. We have a wonderful guest for you tonight. Karen Armstrong is one of the best known and most widely read authorities on organized religion in the world. The author of more than 18 books, she has written widely on the major faiths of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. She is the biographer of Buddha, St. Paul, and Muhammad. A former Roman Catholic nun, she rose to prominence in 1993 with her book, A History of God, the 4,000-year quest of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Ms. Armstrong has been a teacher, a television host, an advisor to the United Nations on religious matters, and a contributor to publications all over the world. Her work is marked by deep scholarship, a terrifyingly wide range of meticulous research, and deliciously clear writing. I'm pleased that I've talked to Ms. Armstrong over the years on various radio programs, and she is a delight. Her latest book is Field of Blood, Religion and the History of Violence. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Karen Armstrong. Welcome. Nice to have you here. Field of Blood. Was there some incident or series of incidents or some circumstance that prompted you to write it? Because on first reading, it seemed to me that you were writing in answer to something. Is that fair?
Yes. Almost every time I jump into a taxi in London, the cabbie, if he's of a chatty disposition, will ask me what I do for a living. And I cringe because I know what is coming. In the same form of words, almost like a religious mantra, we hear religion has been the cause of all the major wars in history. And I sigh inwardly and wish I could just say I was a typist or something, because I have been struggling with these issues now, especially since September the 11th.
Right.
When I was much asked about them, about the role of Islam, the role of religion. And the more I delved into it, and the more I delved into the history of the state, the history of civilization, I began to see that things were much more complex than that. It's an odd remark to say that religion has been the cause of all the major wars in history, when in its brief lifespan, secularism has been responsible for 2 major world wars.
Certainly.
Which were not fought for religion and for a great deal of violence, the Gulag. And it's very, I'm not saying, my argument is not that religion is not implicated in these things, but that it's never the sole nor even the main motive.
How have we come, though, to equate religion with violence? In our time, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, Voltaire wrote about how religion was the cause of violence. Where does that come from?
It comes from the wars of religion, so-called, in the 16th and 17th century. And these were terrible wars. They left 1/3 of the population of Central Europe dead. And it was traumatic. It was one of those birth pangs. It was actually the birth pang of the sovereign nation state. But people at the time tended to think that they'd been caused entirely by the theological squabbles of the Reformation. And if that were the case, we wouldn't expect to find Catholics and Protestants fighting on the same side, and therefore fighting and therefore killing their co-religionists. Certainly, many of the participants experienced these wars in a religious way because, and we should get into this at some point, our modern conception of religion as a purely private quest that is centered with a clear set of doctrines and beliefs, separate from ordinary life, is something entirely new.
You point out in the book that before Luther, religion was a community affair.
Yes.
And that it was involved in every aspect of daily life, and commerce, and the economy, and business, everything.
Yes, it's very difficult for us to understand because our modern idea of religion as something separate and private is deeply ingrained in our Western secular consciousness. So is what's been called the myth of religious violence, which helped to create that. But no other culture has anything like our conception of religion. Words that we translate religion in other languages invariably has a much wider range of meaning. The Arabic din means a whole way of life. So does dharma, the Sanskrit dharma. The Oxford Classical Dictionary states very firmly no word in either Greek or Latin corresponds to the English religion or religious. The rabbis who composed the Talmud would have found it very difficult to define religion because their aim in the Talmud was to bring the whole of human life into the ambit of the sacred. Religion was not seen as a separate activity. It permeated all aspects of life because we humans need to invest what we do with meaning. We are meaning-seeking creatures. Dogs, as far as we know, don't spend a great deal of time agonizing about the canine condition or the plight of dogs in other parts of the world.
I think it depends on the dog.
You may be right there.
Yeah.
But we do. And if we don't find some significance in our lives, we can fall very easily into despair.
Well, then how do we get to this situation, which is another mantra, and that is the separation of church and state? And in the United States, the founding fathers and Thomas Jefferson, in drawing up the Constitution, said it was not a Christian country. We're going to separate the one from the other. The Establishment Clause of the Constitution rules it out. How did we get to that?
Well, that's after the wars of religion.
Right.
When reeling from these catastrophes, convinced that religion was the cause, even though there was a deep political element. What I wanted to say that before the modern period, before 1800, it would have been 1700, let's say, it would have been conceptually impossible for anybody to say where religion ended and politics began. The two all-state ideologies were pervaded by religion, and trying to take religion out of it would be as difficult as trying to take the gin out of the cocktail.
Is that because of the power of the church?
Not really. It's because of our desire for meaning.
Okay.
And one of the things that happened in the French Revolution, for example, when the first secular state in Europe was created by a huge headlong assault on the Catholic Church, one of the first things that they did was create a new religion called the nation. And nationalism became a kind of religion. You know, I don't know how it is in Canada, but in England, you know, there are moments like royal weddings when we play God Save the Queen, or the last night of the proms when we have some famous opera singer singing Rule Britannia, and on the big screens we see Rule Britannia is being sung, and you know, up in the north, in Wales, even in Scotland, and our hearts swell within us, and we feel sort of one with all, and we feel a pride in being British. She's singing Rule Britannia, totally irrational, because it's been a long time since Britain ruled any waves.
Yes.
But this is the mythology, and this, in some sense of the secular world, you could say that the nation, our devotion to the nation, has replaced God, because it's, if you think of the sacred as something for which you're prepared to die, to give your life, that it's so inviolable that your death is worth it, it's now not acceptable any longer to die for your religion, but it's admirable to die for your country.
Has there been historically a tendency for nation states or empires or whatever to use religion, to mold it to its particular ideology or its politics? Or
you see, that's a modern question, because you're still seeing them as separate. You're still seeing a religion as something a bit separate,
right,
that you drag in, that would not have occurred before 1700. The separation of church and state, which John Locke proposed after the Wars of Religion, was as radical an innovation as the commercial economy that Europe was developing at this time, that would soon change the entire world, which would overcome the entire world. And it's very difficult for us. I had a great job when I was writing the book, using the word religion in the past, because I knew that it would raise that it had connotations for my Western readers.
But didn't we learn in school that the Enlightenment replaced God with science?
Oh, well, no, that's a kind of mythology in the bad sense. The Enlightenment philosophers were deeply religious. Look at Newton, who creates his solar system, he sees as a proof for God's existence. He said that it was one of his purposes while he was discovering this, making this extraordinary scientific leap, that it would work, he said, with considering people for belief in a deity. That would have made people's hair turn in their graves earlier, because in the pre-modern period, it was taken for granted that the natural world could tell us nothing about God.
But Voltaire didn't.
Voltaire, but he was obsessed with religion. And even he said, people need it. You've got to have it. And so they were imbued with religion, and they were behind the separation of church and state. And I'm happy with that, not least because it's good for religion. Because once religion gets tied up in the governmental structures of the state, it gets tied up in state violence, the inevitable injustice of state life, and even an ironic, peaceful religion such as Christianity, when it becomes an imperial religion, gets totally transformed.
Then how did we come to the idea that religion is to blame for human violence? You talk in the book about the scapegoat theory.
Yeah, and in the ancient Israel, of course, you know the story that the high priest would bring two goats into the temple, and one of them would be killed for the sake of the people, and then on the other he would lay his hands on this goat, loading all the sins of the people onto it and literally placing the blame elsewhere and driving it out into the wilderness. In this way, Moses said, the animal will carry your sins away into a desert place. And I am concerned, it's not that religion is not implicated, especially some recent atrocities, but if we consider it as the sole reason, like some kind of chemical that once you put it in with politics, there's an explosion, this means that we are not looking carefully enough at all the other factors involved. Historians of warfare tell us that we never go to war for a single reason or for a single motive. Right. That we may have a motive like nationalism, for example, or we may say if we're going on a crusade that we're doing it for God. But there are always other factors involved: political, territorial, and above all, economic. The competition for scarce resources.
Then, how much is religion used as a cover for political violence?
Again,
yes.
Again, this is the same thing. Now, in modern periods, I don't think it's exactly a cover. I think that a lot of the people who are saying they claim it still see that religion as that cocktail, because they haven't had our modern Western modernization period. And so for them, religion still pervades political life. The Quran, for example, which I'm sure you're longing to get your teeth into, is not about doctrine or belief. It is a cry for justice. The bedrock message of the Quran is that it's wrong to build a private fortune and good to share your wealth to create a just and decent society where vulnerable people are treated with respect. Similarly, the prophets of Israel had no time for people who said their prayers but kept out of politics. They had harsh words for those who attended the rituals in the temple but gave no thought to the poor and the needy, and crying out against the injustice of their rulers.
Just to go back to the Crusades for a moment, it's been said it's all about looting, really, essentially. But was it not motivated by a religious impulse?
It's a very good example. This is one of the things where you see that cocktail, because certainly looting was essential. Looting was a major means for a state, pre-modern state, to acquire wealth. And knights regarded looting as absolutely okay, and part of the only way they could earn a living, in fact. So looting would certainly have been part of it, but not just for looting. Certainly, many of the Crusaders had dreamed that they were fighting for Jesus and getting back his patrimony, and that he was their feudal lord. They were going to get the Holy Land back. But the popes were deeply political in there. The Pope, when he let, in 1095, and he let the knights of Europe loose on the Muslim world, one of his aims, he had two political aims. One was to increase the power of the Western Church in the East. He was coming to the aid of the Byzantine Christians who did not accept the supremacy of the Pope. So it was a political thing. He was also using the crusade as part of his campaign to become the chief ruler, the chief monarch of Europe. And by the end of the Crusades, the knock-on effect of the political effect of a leader, a crusading leader, in Europe was more important than what happened in the Holy Land. But what interests me about the Crusades is the Muslim response. Because, we think that the Quran is manically intent on jihad. And so But in fact, the word jihad and its derivatives occurs only 41 times in the Quran, and in only 10 of those instances does it refer unequivocally to warfare. The word jihad, it means struggle, and sometimes
personal, spiritual
struggle, and sometimes it's a struggle to give to the food to the needy when you have little yourself. And there's a famous hadith which has the Prophet saying on returning from a battle, we are returning from the lesser jihad, that's the battle, to the greater jihad. That is the far more important and more difficult struggle to reform your own society and your own heart. Now, you'd think, though, that when the Crusaders arrived in 1099 in Jerusalem, conquered the third holiest city in the Muslim world,
Jerusalem, yes.
Jerusalem, slaughtered the inhabitants for 2 solid days, that they would be, the Muslim world would descend upon them in wrath. ISIS would look puny compared to this assault. Not a bit of it. The Crusaders established states, little princedoms, kingdoms, 5 of them, our first Western colonies. And the emirs in the region, they were shocked by the Crusades. The chroniclers had never seen anything like this violence from the West. They had fought the great powers of the region for years, but they'd never seen, always within carefully defined limits. The gloves were off. But for the first 50 years after the conquest of Jerusalem, the emirs went on fighting one another as usual for territory, land, and booty, and they made alliances with the various crusaders against one another.
All right,
and if I could just finish,
please.
When finally they get their act together and say, look, crusaders are pouring in from Europe in vast numbers, we've got to do something, it still took Nur ad-Din and Salah ad-Din 30 years to revive the jihad spirit, which was absolutely dead. It was revived, and it's never quite gone away in that region, as the result of a sustained assault from the West.
All right, you raise a subject that I think is fraught with confusion, which is something with which I'm intimately familiar. You say at one part of the book that the early record of Islam is far more tolerant than the early record of Christianity. Moving up to our time, Sam Harris, the famous atheist, says that a hatred of infidels is arguably the central message of the Quran. I want to believe you. I don't know whether I believe him. I'm confused.
Yeah, I'm confused too, that anyone who's actually studied the Quran could come to that conclusion. It really is not. The Quran has no conception of an exclusive religion.
Well, what's an infidel then?
Kafir does not mean infidel, a non-believer. The word, it means someone who's insolent, aggressive, arrogant, and intent on warfare. And there are a lot of them in Mecca. So he's talking about the kafirun who are fighting him and his little sect. But it's not, the Quran has very little time for religious orthodoxy or theology of any kind, which it calls zanna, self-indulgent guesswork about matters that nobody can be certain of one way or the other, but which makes people quarrelsome and stupidly sectarian. The Quran insists that all the great prophets of the past must be honored. You cannot be a Muslim unless you also accept that Jesus, the veracity of Jesus, Moses, and today Muslim scholars tell us that had the Prophet known about the Buddhists and the Hindus and about the Australian Aborigines and the Native Americans here, he would have praised their religious leaders too. And the Quran takes Muhammad to task at one point, saying, look, Muhammad, the Prophet's a bit disappointed that not many people are joining up with his ummah, his community. If we had wanted to put the whole of humanity into a single religious community, we would have done so. But it was not our will. Religious pluralism is God's will. The Quran is offended by the idea that people are saying, you've got to be a Jew, you've got to be a Christian to be saved. It was not in their heads, as it were, because they got the old idea of religion.
But people have compared and I know nothing about the Quran, I know very little about the Bible, but people have compared some elements of the Quran with the Old Testament of the Bible. That in the Quran it said the infidels must be killed. And in the Old Testament there are all kinds of killings and mutilations and all that kind of thing. What are we to believe?
Well, basically, that there's very little about the killing of infidels or killing of kafirun, the people of Mecca who are cruelly intent on exterminating the Muslim community. The word kafir it means irascible, angry, violent. Even those, there are very few passages where the Prophet came to the Prophet while he was about to lead his troops into warfare to save the Muslims from little Muslim community from extermination, where it says, he says, kill them all, etc. Obviously, no general who's leading his troops into battle is going to say, just be nice guys, be peaceable and let them all go. But always these aggressive passages, which are often quoted by the likes of Harris, segue in every case to a plea for reconciliation, forgiveness. But if they
forgiveness by whom of what?
If they desist from attacking, you immediately lay down your arms.
I see.
As soon as the enemy sues for peace, you must give it to him. Reconciliation is better for your souls. Constantly that. Now the interesting thing was that after the Prophet, the war turned slightly in the Prophet's favor, he embarked on an extraordinarily audacious policy of non-violence. He announced to his community in Medina that he was going to make the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca in the appropriate pilgrimage month, and that meant that when you're on pilgrimage you may not carry arms. That's so right. He was going to ride into enemy territory unarmed into the lion's den. And he invited Muslims to accompany him. 1,000 Muslims volunteered, several of them women, and indeed the Meccans did send out the cavalry, and they managed to escape, and they got into the sanctuary of Mecca where all violence was forbidden, and they sat down. We called it a sit-in in the old days. And there they waited for the Meccans to negotiate. And there Muhammad gave away everything that they had won, and the Quran, and this was the beginning, the turning point. Historians of warfare, not religious apologists, tell us that the Prophet Muhammad and the first caliphs must be some of the few empire builders who created an empire. The Prophet in Arabia, the caliphs in the Middle East, mostly by negotiation.
You have been accused by Professor Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, others, of being an apologist for Islam, that you whitewashed the essential message of Islam.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, what can you say? I mean, why did I get into this? Not because I'm filled with love and kindness and joy or kumbaya spirit and just like to push things under the carpet, but from a feeling of great dread.
Of?
A dread of where we're heading. Because sometimes I read, in the work of the gentlemen you've mentioned, as well as others, other people's, vituperative speech against Islam that reminds me of what was going on in Europe in the 1930s and 40s.
Against the Jews.
Against the Jews. And I feel that we in Europe, at least, cannot afford that kind of speech. We've got a bad record for it. And when those Danish cartoons came out, I remembered that the Nazi assault began with a series of state-orchestrated cartoons depicting Jews in this way. We cannot afford it. And when you do this, you send a wonderful message that the extremists, the ISIS people, can use all this propaganda saying the West is inherently Islamophobic and wants to destroy Islam.
But I've talked to, and I'm sure you have, talked to Salman Rushdie, who spent 8 or 9 years being protected by British authorities because of a fatwa that said he should be killed. And in fact, his translator, one of his translators was killed.
Yes, this is appalling. And it was entirely un-Islamic. This is done not probably by the Ayatollah Khomeini, because he was dying at that time,
yes.
but by the people around him. But it was deeply against the Iranian clerical tradition, especially of Khomeini's mentor, Mullah Sadra, who was dead against any form of censorship. Passionately against in the 17th century, passionately against any form of censorship.
But who was making the case then?
Basically, they were doing this as a power game, politics again. Politics be, you infusing a sort of religious thing. And it was appalling, and I had no time for that fatwa. I liked the novel very much. I could see exactly what Rushdie was trying to do. Satanic Verses. Yeah. I could see exactly what Rushdie was trying to do. What I didn't like, and what started this feeling of dread in me, was the fact that his supporters, his liberal supporters in the newspapers, segued from a denunciation, quite great denunciation of the fatwa, into an out-and-out denunciation of Islam as an evil, violent, and bloodthirsty religion. Now, you know when you're listening to some talk show or phone-in, and you know something about the subject under discussion, it gives you an intellectual pain sometimes to listen to these things. And it's just not accurate. And it filled me with that dread I've mentioned. I said, this is what led to the horrors of the 30s and 40s. And indeed, by the time that decade was out, there were concentration camps on the outskirts of Europe, this time with Muslims in them, in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Was 9/11 a particular challenge for you?
Oh, it was awful. I watched the towers come down. I was actually packing to come to the United States the next day. And of course, like as all of us, shocked to the core. When many things went through my mind, I thought, so this is what I was afraid of. This kind of build-up of hatred which can be manipulated by unscrupulous people like bin Laden. And again, out of course came, quite understandably that it was all caused by Islam. But if you listened to, I'm not saying religion isn't implicated. Religion was implicated just as Judaism was implicated in the murder of President Rabin. And Christianity was somehow implicated in the symbolism of the Ku Klux Klan. But this is not what the tradition is saying. And out came all the old stuff. Now, yes. But if you listened to bin Laden, you'd see that it was the cocktail. It was just as political as it was religious.
Let me ask you this. I'll posit the scenario that for whatever reason, hatred of the West or whatever reasons, Al-Qaeda and the other groups, and for their own political reasons, want to establish something, and in order to attract followers, they appeal to their innate religious instincts. Is there anything in that?
There is that. Of course, they use sort of certain religious words that have resonance, and Muslim discontent and Muslim distress. And there's a lot of that. But after 9/11, and this should have been blazoned on in every Western newspaper, the Gallup did a poll, the biggest poll they'd ever done, took 7 years, in 35 Muslim-majority countries, asking a load of really interesting questions, and millions of Muslims responded. And one of the questions was, were the 9/11 attacks justified?
Yeah.
93% said no. They were on no account justified, but there was and they quoted the reasons they gave for their decision was that we're all religious. They quoted from the Quran about when you take one life, you take the whole world. Those 7% who said they were justified, their reasoning was entirely political rather than religious at all.
I don't want to get into dueling polls, but there was a poll taken in the UK, among Muslim university students. And I think it was in the lower 51, 52%, agreed with the proposition that killing in the name of Islam was justified.
Yeah, you see, there's some bad things have happened in the Muslim world in recent years, especially since the 1970s. And that is Saudi Arabia has exported its very, very narrow form of Islam, a maverick form of Islam, the Wahhabis, throughout, in every place where Muslims live. And Wahhabism does not just dislike other religions, it dislikes all other Muslims except Wahhabis. So Sunnis who take on pieties after the time of the Prophet, Sunnis, Shia, Sufis, they're all out. Now, it's as though a tiny sect in the southern states of the United States had the petrodollars and the support of a great power, that's the United States, to export its message. It would transform the world of Christianity. They give funding that you have to certain countries that need it, such as Bosnia after the war, but it comes with a price tag that you have to have a Wahhabi priest. So people have grown up with this element. True, in England is a very, very secular country, probably like Canada in a way, not like the United States. And the Muslims there tend to be extremely secular, and they've got a Wahhabi tinge, and they have no help from their imams. In the United States, can cherry pick its immigrants, and so academics and professionals will go to the US. People from tiny villages in Bangladesh, say, will come to Britain, and they bring their imams with them. And these imams are utterly uneducated. And so they can give no guidance at all to the young. Two of the people who recently left Birmingham, England, to join the jihad in Syria, had ordered 2 books from Amazon. One was Islam for Dummies. The other was the Quran for Dummies. And people have, there've been extensive surveys taken of the people, of all the huge range of people who were involved in the 9/11 atrocity on the outskirts, as well as the lone wolves, like the shoe bomber afterwards. And they found, these are forensic psychiatrists, and one, a former CIA officer. And he found that only 20% of the people involved in these atrocities had a typical Muslim upbringing. The rest were either converts to Islam, like the Canadian recently, in the recent
shot the soldier in Ottawa,
or else they are non-observant until they meet up with the movement, like the Boston Marathon bombers, or they're self-taught. And he said, he concluded, the CIA officer, the problem is not Islam, but ignorance of Islam. And the chief cause that drives young men to warfare, and in this case that they found, was a sense of hopelessness, alienation, boredom.
But don't we have to believe that what some of the leadership says, that the leaders believe? In other words, Mr. al-Baghdadi, the head of Islamic State, he wants to establish a caliphate running from Syria to the Gulf and all of that under Sharia law, with reference to the Quran all the time. And by the way, along the way, there's a few beheadings every once in a while.
But
don't we have to believe him that he's serious?
You can believe. Look, if someone is playing, an untalented beginner claims to be playing a Beethoven sonata, he may claim to be playing it, but what we hear is a cacophony for which Beethoven is not responsible. And but Sunni and Shia alike are united against this. Really right-wing or tending towards extremist ulama have condemned al-Baghdadi and the ISIS. And as for the beheadings, it's not some barbarous thing going back to the Dark Ages. This is a very modern movement. The modern world has been, modernity has been characterized, our secular modernity has been characterized by mass slaughter. The French Revolution that brought the first secular state in Europe into being, in 1 year, the revolutionaries publicly beheaded 17,000 men, women, and children.
This is the terror.
This is the reign of terror. Later, in that same year, when there was an uprising in Western France against the anti-Catholic policies of the regime, the revolutionary armies were sent in told to spare no one, and they killed 250,000 of their own people. This has gone on, and you think of the Young Turks who seized power in Turkey during World War I, deeply secular, indeed atheistic, who slaughtered over a million Armenians to create a...
And Ataturk hated Muslims, didn't he?
Ataturk hated Islam, he hated Muslims. He completed the ethnic purge of the Young Turks had begun by deporting all Greek Christians out into what it would become Greece. They wanted nationalism. I talked about the religion of nationalism a bit earlier. It has an Achilles heel, and this was first noted by Lord Acton as early as the late 19th century, where the new nation state was coming into being. And he said, in the nation state, the stress on ethnicity, language, and culture would make it very perilous for those people in the country who did not fit the national profile. And an intolerance of ethnic minorities, such as Ataturk had, and you think of the Holocaust, has been the Achilles heel of the nation state. In fact, the persecution of ethnic minorities, or an intolerance of them, and in Britain now, the whole of the politics of the moment is about immigration. Yes. Yeah. And Scotland, not wanting anything to do with Britain and all that. So this persecution and intolerance of minorities in the nation state has replaced the persecution of heretics in the religiously articulated state.
Our audience wants to have at you, but there's a kind of hand grenade in the text toward in which you talk about the West's. You use the phrase structural violence toward the Middle East. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not. I don't just use it of the modern West. If you'll have noticed. That structural violence it was prevalent in every single pre-modern culture.
What is it?
It is when the structures of society suppress, deprive, enslave, despoil the majority of the population. In a pre-modern agrarian state, in every pre-modern state, whether we're talking about China, the Middle East, Greece, Rome, Europe, whatever, a tiny aristocracy commandeered the agrarian surplus of 90% of the population, the peasants, and kept them living at subsistence level. So for that 5,000 years, the majority of human beings were reduced to serfdom, hardly with enough to eat. And this iniquitous system, this is structural injustice, this iniquitous system, historians tell us, was probably necessary for our progress, because without it, we would not have been able to create a privileged class which had the leisure to create the arts and the sciences on which our progress depended. And Thomas Merton, the American Trappist, said that in any system of structural violence where anybody who has benefited from it in any way is implicated in that violence. And if I could just finish, the prophets of Israel, Muhammad, the religion doesn't just do violence, it also has been cried out against violence throughout the ages. Right from early Mesopotamia, you have poets, sages, mystics calling out against this system and about the plight of the majority, saying this is wrong, even though they can find no solution. So the West, we don't do that in the same way in our industrialized societies. But there's a new system now where there's a two-tier system in the world where here we are living lives of unbelievable privilege. Yes. And I've started the Charter for Compassion, and we've created a network of cities of compassion. And this has all got to be practical, no lovey-dovey stuff. But they've got to have some practical objectives. I was asked once, what should a compassionate city look like? And I said a compassionate city should be an uncomfortable city. We should be, the Prophet Muhammad said, not one of you can be a believer if he can sleep when he knows that somebody is hungry. And we must be aware that we are living in a bubble of absolute privilege. Look at the Ebola, the plight of the Ebola sufferers, with no clean water, no sanitation, all this. We have to bear it in mind, or else.
But we react hysterically.
Yes, and we don't know quite how to. It's hard to deal with it, but this we must do. In our globalized society, you see, we are so interconnected and interrelated that economists tell us that a bad economy in Africa will redound on our economy. What is happening in Syria and Iraq today has already had a blowback effect in Canada. When markets fall in one part of the world, they plummet all around the globe that day, but we still don't see it. When Cain killed his brother Abel, and this is in the epigraph to my book, he said, "Where's your brother?" And Cain says, "I don't know. Am I the guardian of my brother?" And God said, "What have you done? Your brother's blood is crying to me from the soil." So interconnected are we now, and so are our histories interconnected. We British have helped to create the mess in the Middle East. So these people are our brothers and sisters, and we must feel uncomfortable about their plight.
We'll go to the audience, but it was W.H. Auden who said, "We must love each other or die."
And I think now that unless we learn to implement the golden rule globally, so that never, as Confucius put it, never impose on others what you yourself do not desire, and stop supporting rulers who are tyrants to get cheap oil, all this kind of thing, supporting systems of injustice, I think we're not going to have a viable world for the next generation.
Thank you, ma'am. Karen Armstrong. That's wonderful. We have a microphone here in the center aisle. If you have questions, I would implore you to keep them fairly short so we can get a number of questioners. No red statements, please. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, you.
Okay. No, I was looking there. Okay. You know, Aris, other atheists, do you accept really atrocious opposition to what everything you said? Do you accept criticism, harsh, really criticism, or not?
Sorry, what was the... What?
Do you accept criticism of the
Harsh
things you said?
criticism.
Harsh criticism.
I get it all the time. I should have got used to it by now.
The first rule of history is ignore what they say, ignore what they write, and look what they do. So the Quran, the Bible can all be good, golden words. The deed condemns them, not the words. Okay. And you violated that rule. Okay, more. There's more. For instance,
You've asked the question. Let me get Ms. Armstrong to answer. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what we are. We are violent creatures.
Well, hang on a second. There's a gentleman behind you, too, who wants to ask. Go ahead.
We are violent creatures, and violence has been endemic to our history. The vast majority of our history, we were professional killers. Men in particular love fighting.
Yes.
And the state, that structure of violence that I spoke of, you know, even in our democratic societies, there is a gap between rich and poor that we are never able quite to fulfill. And we keep on trying, and we keep on failing, you're right. But we are forked creatures, if you like. We can dream of peace and justice, even though probably none of us have ever lived in a society where justice has been achieved. But we still believe that that is, and we keep enunciating this, and we must keep enunciating this.
Thank you, sir. No, I'm sorry, there's a gentleman behind you who wants to.
I just want to say something. What's the first commandment in the Bible? I'm the only God. Nobody else. That's an act of war, act of hatred. The same first commandment in the Quran. I'm the only God. That's act of terrorism.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
That's the practice instead of the theory. Okay, and that comes all the evil of this world.
Terrific. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
I'll just answer that, if I may. The first commandment, I talk about this, of course, in the chapter, or my chapter on the Hebrews, is quite a late addition to the Bible. The Ten Commandments were introduced by some reformers with a particularly xenophobic ideology. And they're the ones, these Deuteronomists, who have all the violent bits in the Hebrew Bible about the massacre where God says you've got to kill all the Canaanites. Then the thing about the Bible is this was rewritten by priests who rewrote in the books of Chronicles and in the books of Leviticus, who rewrote this and tried to contradict it. Instead of killing all the inhabitants of Canaan because they were unbelievers, they said, for example, if a stranger lives with you in your land, do not molest him. You must treat him as one of your own people and love him as yourself. You were strangers in Egypt. The golden rule again. Look into your past. Remember your own pain as an ethnic enslaved minority. Don't inflict that on anybody else.
You've had, thank you, sir. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hi. At the very beginning of the lecture, you said, and I'm hoping you were joking, that the first two world wars, secularism was responsible for them.
Sorry?
Secularism was responsible for the first two world wars, the only two world wars we've had.
Secularism.
Yes, I said they were fought for secular nationalism.
Well, you know, I mean...
They weren't fought for religion, was my point.
The Emperor of Japan was a religious figure. Hitler widely quoted. Hitler was a Catholic, by the way, quite regularly quoted from Martin Luther's writings, verbatim, and the Allies were singing "Praise the Lord" and "Pass the ammunition." So I don't know why you would be saying the words were fought for secularism.
Why are you saying it was secular rather than religious?
Well, these were not crusades. And they were fought by secular states who had separated religion and politics. In these secular nation states, they were fought for the honor of the nation rather than for. But the nation inspires quasi-religious fervor. And Martin Luther is no friend of mine, I have to say. You know, I mean, I know I was brought up Catholic, but I say in my book that he is the first European to advocate the separation of religion and politics, but he also said to the princes of Germany, kill all the peasants who had risen up in the war, in rebellion against the injustice of their lot. So, you know, Martin Luther is a difficult soul. And there are many difficult souls who advocate religion, just as there are difficult souls who have, like Saddam Hussein, who have a secularist ideology. That's what we are. But to say that these were religious wars, I think would be a mistake.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Sorry, I'm going to sound horrible, I have a cold. But I'm sort of wondering about something. You talked about the idea of structural violence and how that kind of ties in, and I'm wondering if what we're also seeing is almost like a malaise. Like people aren't getting civically involved. We're being taught, you know, you can't change the laws, you can't challenge the systems of power. And I'm wondering how that kind of ties into this, in that not only do you have these systems of structural violence, but we're now being taught that it's not worth the effort to try and change them. I mean, look at, for example, the really low voter turnouts. Things like that. And I'm just kind of wondering where that all fits in.
The idea that, if I understand the question, is
hear very well.
we're being taught that there's nothing to be done. There's no way we can change things.
Yeah,
that the system is...
Yeah, the system is just, it's set.
It's set.
Well, systems are never set, you know, ultimately. And I think that the nation state, for example, its limitations are becoming clear in our globalized world, because it's not encouraging us to do what the religions did at their best, to tell us to love the stranger, love the enemy, look out for all tribes and nations, but it concentrates on the well-being of our nation. But we have to keep crying out against this, I think. Because Jesus was crying out against the injustice of Roman Palestine.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And was actually put to death by the Roman Empire, and it must have seemed hopeless. But still, we have to do it. Still, there has to be a witness, and things can change. One person can change things. Look at Martin Luther King, who changed the whole position and brought in civil rights to the United States.
And a religious man himself.
And a religious man. Look to Gandhi, who was able to achieve the independence of India by peaceful means. These are one people. And if we all said it's no good, we can't do anything, but if we all got active in our particular spheres, whether we're lawyers or military, in the military, or in politics, or in the media, or educators, we could have an amazing effect if we were all concerned about the plight of our brothers and sisters throughout the world.
Yes, sir.
Okay. If I understood you correctly, you said that it isn't appropriate to condemn Islam in the way that Hitchens and Harris do, but it is appropriate to condemn Wahhabism. And that makes me wonder, on what basis is religious condemnation appropriate? I just want to finish one last line. In other words, what are the features of religions, of any religions, which
we should rightfully condemn?
I think if you have a religiously based ideology that preaches some form of hatred and discrimination, it's not good religion. If it preaches the suppression of other people, then it's like bad art. Art is very difficult to do well. And I see religion as a kind of art form. It's to help us to try to find meaning in our lives, to give us moments of transcendence and wonder. And but not everybody who has piano lessons is going to end up like Vladimir Ashkenazi. So that we have we have a genius for fouling things up. In my book, basically, there's a consensus that the golden rule is the test of spirituality. And if you don't do to others what you would not like done to yourself, I would say that is probably you're departing from the tradition. And Wahhabism is not all bad. Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who founded it in the 18th century, had a very different idea from the Saudi monarchs today. But he didn't believe in all this condemning of other faiths. This sort of came in a bit later. So it's very difficult to sum up Wahhabism, just as it's very difficult to make any kind of summary of any complex faith tradition.
But if I could just jump in, violence and religion tend to cohabit in many. I mean, the United States is a noisily religious country and also a very violent country.
And Britain is a very unreligious country and has never been very religious, never been good at religion at all. I'm Irish. And yet we've been sort of a great military power ourselves. So since we became a deeply secular people. So we have a tendency always to do the us and the them. It's the way we slant our world. There's us, which we feel comfortable with, there's them. The nation state helps us with that. And we can do it with religion too, even though there are sages who say, no, extend yourself beyond that. And in warfare, that becomes very clear.
Yes, sir.
I wonder if Ms. Armstrong would like to comment on the nuance she might see between great religious teaching and institutional religion. So perhaps I could give you an example. If we go back to your alma mater, and we go back to Oxford, if you walk out on Broad Street, you will see the Martyrs' Memorial, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, sadly, acknowledges the death of Cranmer, Lidley, and Latimer, who were burnt at the stake for the Vulgate, or disputes about the Vulgate, by the Church itself. And this is in a pre-sovereign nation state, time-wise. So how do you look at organized religion when it is in an institutional context?
I think where religion goes really wrong is when it becomes identified with the state. And that's why Queen Mary, who was Catholic, got her church behind them to execute those people. Institutionalized religion, I limped away from it myself for years and said I wanted nothing to do with it ever again. It can sometimes surprise you. I mean, I never thought I'd hear myself saying these words, but I really like what the Pope is doing at the moment. This is something, he's giving us all a bit of a shock. The institution is what is dangerous is institutional idolatry. When your institution becomes more important than the transcendent itself, or becomes identified with it, or you say, or as with the hideous cases of child abuse that were covered up in the Catholic Church, so lest it sully the authority of the Church. This is just sheer criminal. nonsense, and it's an idolatry. It's raising a purely human institution to a high level. Institutionalism, to have an institutionalized religion, it preserves certain kinds of wisdom. You know, you preserve a tradition in that way, but the trick is that you very soon try and start to make it more important than the transcendence for which we're all striving.
Thank you very much.
Yes, yes, sir, behind, yes.
Okay. Thanks for coming to talk to us, and thank you for your book. I'd like to get your comment on a book that came out 2 years ago, and if not the book, then the idea. And it's titled The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined by Steven Pinker. And so in a nutshell, he took a lot of data from archaeologists, anthropologists, people all over the world for millennia, from hunter-gatherers up until 20th century, to look at the decline in violence and that showing us that today is the most peaceful time in the history of the earth. And he has things in the book that go against some of the things in your book, but I'd like to look at the big idea and get you to comment on that.
Yeah, you see, I just sometimes wonder what sort of world he's living in. I mean, it's fine. I mean, and I'm sure he's right in many ways, that, you know, violence on the street, all these things are cut down with by force, and not just because we're such loving people, but because, you know, we know we're going to be clobbered, and state surveillance is much more, can hold us in check more than it ever could before. All that is true. But, you know, one of the things that I finish up with in my book is a profound distress about the increase in civilian deaths in our warfare. In the First World War, only 5% of the people who died were civilians. That number shot up in World War II to 66.5%, when the Allies carefully targeted neighborhoods that were civilians and created firebombs that to hideous effect in Japanese and German cities. And now 90% of the people who are dying in these current wars are civilians who simply have died because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this should concern. This is what I mean by being uncomfortable. Yeah. This should make us profoundly uncomfortable. And it's absolutely right that we should honor the soldiers who die in our wars on our behalf and honor them. I think we should think of the people who died simply by accident for being there.
Last question. Yes, sir.
Two short questions. Granted, Islam is no longer Islam, it's Wahhabism, or call it Islamofascism, something else. Doesn't it have to be fought? Whatever you want to call it. Second question, would you comment on the slaughter of Christians, innocent Christians, all over not only the Middle East, but Africa, other parts of the world? Thanks.
I didn't quite get the first part of that question.
Shouldn't certain elements of Islam be fought?
Yes.
Have to be fought.
I mean, certainly if you've got people like Osama bin Laden and that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, I don't see what we can do with ISIS other than fight them, even though it's going to create more civilian deaths, inevitably, with our bombing.
Doesn't it also add to the recruitment elements of some of these groups?
Islam?
The fighting them. When the West goes in, fighting.
I think there's always that danger.
Enlistment goes up.
I don't see, we can't let these people go marauding around in this way. Yes, I think sadly, I'm not saying that we'll ever be without war. I think war is a part of human life. Sadly, it's with us. The trick is to keep it to as a minimum with violence. War historians tell us that without professional disciplined armies, humanity would probably degenerate into warring hordes. Without, force. The state is founded on force, and we all live in states. Now, the other question was
the persecution of Christians in Syria and Africa.
This has largely, this has been one of the results, one of the nation state. which makes minorities, cultural minorities, personae non grata. And that's true in the Middle East. Also, the Christianity is unjustly associated with Western imperialism. When Osama bin Laden used to talk, do you remember, about Zionists and Crusaders? People often thought this was a sort of religious term, but in the Middle East, ever since the early 20th century, the word crusade, al-Salibiyya, has always been, has become a political term referring to the Western imperial assault, which they recall the first encounter they had with the West in the Crusades.
And George Bush used that very
Very
phrase.
unfortunately, yes. Yeah. He tried to retract it later. This sort of fed into all that. It's terrible, but it's rather politically motivated rather than theologically or religiously motivated.
Just one follow-up question. Who do we believe when Obama says that this is un-Islamic, what ISIS is doing? The head of ISIS and others say it is Islam. They're doing it in the name of Islam. Who do we believe? This is a problem.
Yes, and I think what we've all got to do is educate ourselves about Islam so that we're not dependent on the likes of even the President of the United States or Mr. Baghdadi. We all have, there's a great deal of unsubstantiated certainty in our world. We're encouraged, in the age of information, we can gather information very easily at the click of a mouse, and we are encouraged, quite rightly, to hold forth on our own opinions. For myself, I think the secret for peace is to go back to Socrates and to recognize the founder of the Western rational tradition, who reminded us of how little we know. Socrates, on the last day of his life, said that he was wise only in one respect, that he knew nothing at all. And we are so opinionated, and the way we sort of conduct our discourse is not Socratic. We don't listen to one another. We're too busy it's not enough for us to seek the truth. Somehow we have to defeat and humiliate our opponents. I think we're in a situation now where we don't know where we're going. Our financial institutions look in disarray. We can't get, we were all proudly saying in Britain, we're out of recession. We seem to be going back into it again. The international policies have clearly not been working. We don't know what to do about the environment. There's a great deal of concern about it, but we don't know what to do. And I think we should just, mouthing all these certainties that are partial. Sometimes when people are talking about Islam, it offends me simply because the amount of reliable information that they seem to have could be comfortably contained on the back of a small postcard. And we live it's an age of sound bites. And we hear about trouble spot in one part of the world, then another crisis comes, and we forget that these problems are still festering on. So I think dialogue, it seems to be the buzzword of our time, but that means listening. And it means allowing ourselves to be changed, not weakly going over to the other side, but allowing some of our opinions to be shaken in some way. The Taoists called it the art of forgetting, to get beyond received wisdom, and as Socrates said, to question stringently every single one of our received opinions and most clearly held certainties.
Thank you, ma'am. Karen Armstrong, thank you.